The bustling airport terminal hummed with activity as travelers rushed to catch their flights. Amid the chaos, Lieutenant Commander Samantha Carter stood out, her crisp Navy uniform a stark contrast to the sea of casual attire surrounding her. She gripped her carry-on bag tightly, her dark eyes scanning the boarding area for any sign of movement. Today was supposed to be a routine flight, but little did Samantha know it would become anything but ordinary. As the gate agent called for first-class boarding, Samantha confidently approached the counter. She presented her military ID and boarding pass, expecting the usual nod of recognition. Instead, she was met with a puzzled look from the young gate agent. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your ticket is for economy class," the agent said, her voice tinged with confusion. Samantha furrowed her brow. "There must be some mistake. I'm entitled to first-class seating as a military officer." The gate agent's eyes darted nervously between Samantha's face and her computer screen. "I don't see any notation for an upgrade. Perhaps there was an error in the booking?" As the exchange continued, other passengers began to take notice. Whispers and curious glances were directed towards Samantha, who remained composed despite the growing tension. "Could you please double-check?" Samantha asked, her voice calm but firm. "I've never had an issue before." The gate agent tapped away at her keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. After a few moments, she looked up with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, but I'm not seeing any authorization for first-class seating. You'll need to board with the economy passengers." Samantha took a deep breath, weighing her options. She could make a scene, demand to speak to a supervisor, or simply accept the situation and move on. As a naval officer, she was trained to handle high-pressure situations with grace and dignity. But this felt different, a subtle slight that nagged at her conscience. As she contemplated her next move, an older gentleman in line behind her cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gravely with age, but I couldn't help overhearing. "Are you really in the Navy?" Samantha turned, surprised by the interruption. "Yes, sir." "Lieutenant Commander Samantha Carter, United States Navy." The man's eyes widened with recognition. "Well, I'll be damned. My son's in the Navy too. It's a shame they're not treating you right. You ought to speak up, young lady." His words struck a chord with Samantha. She had always been taught to pick her battles wisely, but maybe this was one worth fighting. With renewed determination, she turned back to the gate agent. "I'd like to speak with the pilot, please," Samantha requested, her voice steady and authoritative. The gate agent hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's possible. The pilot is preparing for takeoff and—" "It's important," Samantha interrupted, her gaze unwavering. "I need to discuss this matter with someone in charge." As the tension mounted, other passengers began to voice their support. "Let her talk to the pilot," someone called out. "She serves our country." The commotion caught the attention of the flight crew, and soon a tall, distinguished-looking man in a pilot's uniform approached the gate. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his eyes darting between Samantha and the flustered gate agent. Samantha straightened her posture, years of military training kicking in. "Sir, there appears to be a misunderstanding regarding my seating assignment. As a military officer, I'm entitled to first-class accommodation if available, but I've been denied that privilege today." The pilot studied Samantha for a moment, taking in her impeccable uniform and confident demeanor. "May I see your ID, please?" he asked politely. As Samantha handed over her military identification, a hush fell over the crowd. Passengers craned their necks to watch the exchange, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The pilot examined the ID closely, his eyebrows raising slightly as he read. He looked up at Samantha, a mix of surprise and respect in his eyes. "Lieutenant Commander Carter," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent gate area, "I apologize for the confusion. Your rank certainly entitles you to first-class seating." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Samantha felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew this moment was about more than just a seat upgrade. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice steady. "But I'd like to address the larger issue at hand. It shouldn't take speaking to the pilot for a military officer to be treated with the respect and privileges they've earned." The pilot nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Commander. This is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed immediately." He turned to the gate agent, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Please upgrade Lieutenant Commander Carter to first class and make a note in our system to prevent this from happening again. As the gate agent hurried to comply, a smattering of applause broke out among the waiting passengers. Samantha felt a mix of emotions: pride in standing up for herself, gratitude for the support of strangers, and a lingering sense of frustration that such an incident had occurred in the first place. An elderly woman approached Samantha, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you for your service, dear," she said, patting Samantha's arm. "My husband was a Navy man, and he would be proud to see you standing tall today." Samantha smiled warmly, touched by the woman's words. As she prepared to board the plane, she couldn't help but reflect on the significance of what had just transpired. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about recognition, respect, and the ongoing struggle for equality that many still faced, even in uniform. As she settled into her first-class seat, Samantha's mind raced with thoughts of the future. How many other service members had faced similar situations? What could be done to ensure this didn't happen again? And most importantly, how could she use her position and this experience to effect real change? The plane began to taxi down the runway, but for Samantha, this journey was just beginning. She knew that the events of this day would stay with her, fueling her determination to make a difference not just in the Navy, but in society as a whole. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, Samantha gazed out the window at the sprawling city below. She couldn't help but wonder what other challenges and triumphs lay ahead. One thing was certain: she was ready to face them head-on, with the same courage and dignity she had displayed today. The story of the Black Navy officer denied first class was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning of a much larger tale, one of perseverance, justice, and the power of speaking up. As the plane soared into the clouds, Samantha knew that her next mission was clear: to ensure that no one, regardless of their rank or race, would ever have to fight for the respect they'd earned. Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle tap on Samantha's shoulder. She turned to find a young flight attendant standing next to her seat, a nervous smile on her face. "Excuse me, Commander," the attendant said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The captain would like to speak with you when you have a moment. He's asked if you'd be willing to visit the cockpit after we land." Samantha raised an eyebrow, surprised by the request. It wasn't uncommon for pilots to invite military personnel to visit the cockpit, but given the circumstances of her boarding, this felt different. What could the captain want to discuss? As the flight attendant moved away, Samantha's mind raced with possibilities. Was this a genuine gesture of respect, or was the airline trying to smooth over the incident to avoid bad publicity? And more importantly, how could she use this opportunity to address the larger issues at play? The rest of the flight passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Samantha refined her talking points for the conference, but her thoughts kept drifting to the upcoming meeting with the captain. She knew that this could be more than just a cordial chat. It could be a chance to effect real change, to ensure that no other service member would face the same treatment she had. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., Samantha looked out the window at the nation's capital coming into view. The iconic monuments and buildings stood as reminders of the ideals America strived for: equality, justice, opportunity for all. Yet they also served as stark reminders of how far the country still had to go to fully realize those ideals. The wheels touched down with a gentle thud, and as the plane taxied to the gate, Samantha felt a mix of nervousness and determination. Whatever came next, the meeting with the captain, the conference, and beyond, she was ready to face it head-on. As the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began to stir, Samantha remained seated, her mind focused on the task ahead. She knew that the conversation waiting for her in the cockpit could be a pivotal moment, not just in her career, but in the ongoing struggle for equality and respect in the military. The same flight attendant appeared at her side once more. "Commander Carter, the captain is ready to see you now." Samantha nodded, gathering her belongings and standing up. As she made her way towards the front of the plane, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some offered smiles of encouragement, while others watched with curious expressions. With each step towards the cockpit, Samantha's resolve strengthened. She didn't know exactly what awaited her behind that door, but she was determined to make the most of this opportunity. Whatever happened next, she knew it would be another chapter in her ongoing mission to pave the way for those who would follow in her footsteps. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Samantha's thoughts drifted back to the events that had led her to this moment. Her journey in the Navy hadn't always been smooth sailing, but it had shaped her into the strong, resilient woman she was today. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, Samantha had always dreamed of something bigger. Her father, a retired Army sergeant, had instilled in her a deep respect for military service. But it was her mother, a high school history teacher, who had opened her eyes to the long and complex relationship between African Americans and the U.S. Armed Forces. Samantha remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a teenager, poring over books about the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo Soldiers. She'd been captivated by their stories of bravery and perseverance in the face of discrimination. It was then that she decided she wanted to be part of that legacy, to carry the torch forward and show the world what African American service members could achieve. The decision to join the Navy had come as a surprise to some. Many of her friends had expected her to follow in her father's footsteps and join the Army. But Samantha had always been drawn to the sea, to the idea of sailing across vast oceans and seeing the world from a different perspective. Her time at the Naval Academy had been challenging, to say the least. As one of only a handful of black women in her class, Samantha had often felt isolated and under intense scrutiny. There were days when she wondered if she'd made the right choice, if she was cut out for this life. But then she'd think of her heroes, women like Admiral Michelle Howard, the first African-American woman to command a U.S. Navy ship, and Vice Admiral Samuel L. Gravely, Jr., the first African-American to command a U.S. fleet. Their stories gave her strength, reminding her that she wasn't just doing this for herself, but for all those who would come after her. As she rose through the ranks, Samantha had encountered her fair share of obstacles. There were the subtle slights, being mistaken for a junior officer despite her rank, or having her opinions dismissed in meetings. And then there were the more overt instances of discrimination, like the time a senior officer had suggested she'd only been promoted due to diversity quotas. Each of these experiences had left its mark, but they had also fueled her determination. Samantha had worked twice as hard, studied longer hours, and volunteered for the toughest assignments. She was determined to prove beyond any doubt that she deserved her place in the Navy's upper echelons. And now, here she was, a lieutenant commander with a promising career ahead of her. The incident at the airport had been a stark reminder that the fight for equality was far from over, even for those in uniform. But it had also shown her the power of speaking up, of standing firm in the face of injustice. As the flight attendant offered her a drink, Samantha's mind returned to the present. She politely declined, instead pulling out her laptop. There was work to be done. The conference she was heading to in Washington, D.C. wasn't just any meeting. It was a gathering of high-ranking officers from all branches of the military, focused on addressing issues of diversity and inclusion within the armed forces. Samantha had been invited to speak on a panel about the experiences of women of color in the military. It was an opportunity she didn't take lightly. As she began to review her notes, she couldn't help but feel that today's events had given her even more to talk about. She thought about the other panelists she'd be joining, accomplished women from the Army, Air Force, and Marines. Each of them had their own stories, their own battles fought and won. Samantha wondered how many of them had faced situations similar to hers, how many had been forced to assert their hard-earned rank and privileges. As she worked, Samantha became aware of the curious glances from her fellow first-class passengers. Word of what had happened at the gate had clearly spread. Some looked at her with admiration, others with a mix of curiosity and something else. Was it discomfort? Guilt? She couldn't quite place it. An older gentleman across the aisle cleared his throat, catching her attention. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I just wanted to say that I was impressed by how you handled yourself back there. It's not easy to stand up for yourself like that, especially in uniform." Samantha smiled, appreciating the man's words. "Thank you, sir. It's not always easy, but it's necessary. We all have a responsibility to speak up when we see something wrong." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I served in Vietnam," he said, a faraway look in his eyes. "Things were different then, but in some ways, they haven't changed as much as they should have. It's good to see young officers like yourself pushing for change." Samantha took a deep breath and knocked on the cockpit door. After a moment, it swung open, revealing the captain's weathered face. He smiled warmly, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Commander Carter, thank you for joining me. I'm Captain Michael Reynolds," he said, ushering her inside the compact space. I wanted to personally apologize for the incident earlier and discuss how we can prevent such situations in the future. As they settled into the cramped cockpit, Samantha felt a mix of emotions. She appreciated the captain's gesture but couldn't shake the feeling that this was more about damage control than genuine change. "Thank you, Captain Reynolds," she replied, her voice steady. "I appreciate your concern, but I have to ask, is this conversation happening because of who I am, or because of what happened?" The captain's expression shifted, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "I'd be lying if I said the potential for bad publicity wasn't a factor," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean we don't genuinely want to address the issue." Meanwhile, back in the terminal, word of the incident had spread like wildfire. Social media was abuzz with conflicting accounts of what had transpired. Some praised Samantha's composure, while others questioned whether she had overreacted. The airline's PR team was in crisis mode, scrambling to craft a response that would satisfy all parties. As Samantha and Captain Reynolds continued their discussion, neither was aware of the storm brewing outside. News outlets had picked up the story, and it was quickly becoming a national talking point. The incident was being framed as yet another example of the ongoing struggle for equality, not just in the military, but in society at large. Back in the cockpit, Samantha leaned forward, her eyes locked on the captain's. "Captain, I appreciate your honesty, but this isn't just about me or this one incident. It's about a systemic issue that affects service members of color every day. What concrete steps is your airline willing to take to address this?" Captain Reynolds nodded slowly, considering her words. "You're right, of course. We have diversity training programs in place, but clearly, they're not enough. What would you suggest?" As Samantha began outlining her ideas, her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket. Unbeknownst to her, her story had gone viral. Friends, fellow officers, and even strangers were reaching out, some offering support, others sharing their own experiences of discrimination. In Washington, D.C., the organizers of the Military Diversity Conference were watching the unfolding events with great interest. They saw an opportunity to bring this real-world example into their discussions, to use it as a catalyst for meaningful change. Meanwhile, in a small town in Georgia, Samantha's parents sat glued to their television, watching as their daughter's face flashed across the screen. Her father, the retired Army surgeon, felt a surge of pride mixed with a familiar worry. He knew all too well the challenges his daughter faced, the weight of being a trailblazer. Her mother, the history teacher, saw in Samantha the continuation of a long line of African-American military heroes. She thought of the Tuskegee Airmen, of the Buffalo Soldiers, and now of her daughter, standing tall in the face of adversity. Back on the plane, Samantha was unaware of the ripples her actions had caused. She was focused on the task at hand, on seizing this moment to push for real, lasting change. "Captain," she said, her voice filled with determination, "I believe we have an opportunity here. Not just to fix this one incident, but to set a new standard for how airlines interact with military personnel, especially those from minority backgrounds." As she spoke, laying out her vision for improved training, clearer policies, and better accountability, Captain Reynolds found himself nodding along. He had entered this conversation expecting to smooth over a potential PR nightmare. Instead, he found himself inspired by the passionate, articulate officer before him. "Lieutenant Commander," he said as Samantha finished speaking, "I think you're absolutely right. We can do better, and we must do better. I'd like to bring your suggestions to our executive team. In fact, would you be willing to consult with us on implementing these changes?" Samantha blinked, surprised by the offer. This was more than she had expected, but she quickly saw the potential. "I'd be honored, Captain, but I hope you understand that I'll be pushing for real, measurable changes, not just lip service." Captain Reynolds nodded solemnly. "I wouldn't expect anything less." As their conversation wound down, neither Samantha nor the captain realized that their discussion would soon become part of a much larger national dialogue. The incident on the plane was about to become a flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about race, respect, and equality in America. Stepping out of the cockpit, Samantha was met with a sea of curious faces. Passengers who had lingered to catch a glimpse of her watched with a mix of admiration and curiosity. As she made her way down the aisle, a young black girl, no more than 10 years old, caught her eye. "Are you a real Navy commander?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Samantha knelt down to the girl's level, smiling warmly. "I sure am. And you know what? Maybe someday you could be one too." The girl's face lit up, and Samantha felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she fought so hard, why she refused to back down. It wasn't just about her. It was about paving the way for this little girl and countless others like her. As Samantha finally exited the plane, she was unprepared for the scene that awaited her. A small crowd of reporters had gathered in the terminal, alerted by the viral social media posts about the incident. Camera flashes popped as she emerged, and a cacophony of questions filled the air. For a moment, Samantha froze, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. But then her training kicked in. She straightened her uniform, took a deep breath, and stepped forward to face the cameras. She knew that what she said next could have far-reaching implications, not just for her career, but for the broader conversation about race and respect in the military and beyond. As the reporters pressed closer, the questions overlapping in a jumbled chorus, Samantha raised her hand for silence. The terminal quieted, all eyes on her. In that moment, standing tall in her crisp Navy uniform, Lieutenant Commander Samantha Carter prepared to address not just the gathered crowd, but the nation watching at home. The story of a simple flight had become something much bigger, a catalyst for a long-overdue conversation, and Samantha found herself at the center of it all, ready to use her voice to fight for the change she'd always believed in. As she opened her mouth to speak, the whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to hear what this courageous officer would say next. Samantha took a deep breath, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the crowd. "What happened today goes beyond a simple misunderstanding. It's a reflection of the challenges many service members of color face daily, but it's also an opportunity for positive change." As she spoke, her words resonated far beyond the airport terminal. News channels picked up the live feed, broadcasting her impromptu speech nationwide. In living rooms, offices, and military bases across the country, people paused to listen. "I stand here, not just as a Navy officer, but as a voice for those who have faced similar discrimination," Samantha continued. "It's time for us to have an honest conversation about respect, equality, and the value we place on those who serve our nation." Her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket, but Samantha remained focused. Unknown to her, military leaders, politicians, and civil rights activists were already reaching out, eager to join the conversation she had sparked. Meanwhile, in a sleek corporate office, airline executives huddled around a television, watching the scene unfold with a mix of concern and curiosity. They recognized the potential PR nightmare, but also the opportunity to be at the forefront of meaningful change. Back at the terminal, a senior military official pushed through the crowd. "Lieutenant Commander Carter," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I'm Admiral Johnson. We need to talk." Samantha's heart raced. Admiral Johnson was a highly respected figure in the Navy, known for his no-nonsense approach to leadership. His presence here could mean anything from a reprimand to support. As Samantha followed the Admiral to a quieter area, the crowd's murmurs grew. Speculation ran wild about what this high-level intervention could mean. In a small, private room away from prying eyes, Admiral Johnson turned to face Samantha. His expression was unreadable. "Lieutenant Commander, you've stirred up quite a storm," he said, his tone neutral. Samantha stood at attention, her mind racing. Was her career about to come crashing down around her? Or was this the moment that would define her service in ways she had never imagined? "Sir, I understand that my actions may have been unorthodox, but I stand by my decision to speak up," she said, her voice unwavering despite her internal turmoil. Admiral Johnson's eyes narrowed. "At ease, Carter. What I'm about to tell you will change everything. The Secretary of the Navy is on his way here now. Your actions today have set in motion events that go far beyond a seating dispute on a plane." Samantha's mind reeled. The Secretary of the Navy? This was escalating far beyond anything she had anticipated. What could be so urgent that it required such high-level involvement? As if reading her thoughts, Admiral Johnson continued, "Carter, your story has become a flashpoint in a much larger debate. The President himself has taken notice. There's talk of using this incident as a catalyst for a comprehensive review of discrimination in the armed forces." The weight of the Admiral's words hit Samantha like a tidal wave. What had started as a stand for her own dignity had somehow morphed into a potential turning point for the entire military. Before she could fully process this information, there was a knock at the door. An aide entered, looking slightly flustered. "Sir, ma'am, the secretary has arrived. He's asking to see both of you immediately." As Samantha followed Admiral Johnson out of the room, she felt as though she was walking in a dream. The bustling airport seemed distant, the noise muffled. Her mind was focused on the imminent meeting and the potential consequences of her actions. They were led to a makeshift command center that had been hastily set up in an airport conference room. As the door opened, Samantha saw the Secretary of the Navy standing there, flanked by a team of advisors. The room was tense, filled with an energy that spoke of momentous decisions about to be made. The Secretary stepped forward, his face grave. "Lieutenant Commander Carter, Admiral Johnson, thank you for joining us. What we decide in the next few minutes will have far-reaching implications for the future of our armed forces." As Samantha stood there, facing some of the most powerful figures in the military, she realized that this was more than just about her experience. It was a pivotal moment that could reshape policies, change lives, and potentially transform the culture of the entire U.S. military. The Secretary of the Navy took a deep breath, his next words hanging in the air with immense weight. "Lieutenant Commander Carter, we need you to make a decision. One that will not only affect your career but could change the course of military policy for years to come." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment that would define not just her career, but potentially her entire life. Whatever came next, she knew there was no turning back. The eyes of the nation were upon her, waiting to see what this courageous Navy officer would do in the face of such monumental pressure. As the room fell silent, all eyes turned to Samantha. The next words out of her mouth would set in motion a chain of events that could reshape the landscape of equality and respect in the armed forces. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited for her response, knowing that history was about to be made. Samantha stood tall, her mind racing as she processed the gravity of the situation. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, the door burst open. A frantic aide rushed in, his face pale with urgency. "Mr. Secretary, Admiral," he gasped, "we have a situation. A group of service members at bases across the country have begun peaceful protests in support of Lieutenant Commander Carter. They're demanding immediate action on discrimination in the ranks." The room erupted into chaos. The Secretary's advisors huddled together, whispering furiously. Admiral Johnson's face darkened with concern. This was unprecedented. Active duty personnel staging protests could be seen as a breakdown in military discipline. Samantha felt the weight of responsibility crash down on her shoulders. What had started as a personal stand for dignity had snowballed into a movement that threatened the very structure of military order. The Secretary turned to Samantha, his eyes blazing with intensity. "Lieutenant Commander, this has escalated beyond anything we anticipated. We need your help to defuse this situation before it spirals out of control." Samantha's mind raced. She knew she had to choose her words carefully. Her next actions could either heal the growing rift or deepen the divide irreparably. "Sir," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, "I never intended for this to become a protest movement. But we can't ignore the fact that it has struck a chord with so many service members. This is clearly about more than just one incident on a plane." As she spoke, another aide rushed in, tablet in hand. "Sir, ma'am, you need to see this," he said, turning the screen towards them. On it, live footage showed crowds gathering outside military bases. The protesters were a sea of uniforms: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all standing together in silent solidarity. The sight sent shockwaves through the room. This was no longer just about race or gender. It was about unity across all branches of the military. The very foundation of military structure was being challenged, all sparked by one woman's stand for respect. Admiral Johnson stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Carter, we need a solution, and we need it now. These protests, while peaceful, are a direct violation of military code. We're on the brink of a crisis that could undermine the entire chain of command." Samantha felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her. She knew that her response in this moment would shape not just her future, but the future of the entire U.S. military. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders as she considered her words carefully. Just then, her phone buzzed. Glancing down, she saw a text from her father, the retired army sergeant. "Remember why you joined, Sam. Stand tall." Those simple words cut through the chaos, grounding her. Samantha took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and faced the room. "Sirs," she began, her voice clear and resolute, "I believe we have an opportunity here. These protests show us that the issue of discrimination in the military is far more widespread than we've acknowledged. But they'd also show us something powerful: unity across all branches of service." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on Samantha as she continued. "I propose we don't shut this down. Instead, let's open a dialogue. Let's use this moment to launch a comprehensive, transparent review of our policies and practices, not just about race or gender, but about respect and dignity for all who serve." Her words hung in the air, bold and challenging. The Secretary and Admiral exchanged glances, the tension palpable. This proposal was risky, unprecedented. It could either heal the rift or expose deep-seated issues that the military had long tried to ignore. As the leaders pondered her words, another aide burst into the room. "Sir, the President is on the line. He's demanding an immediate briefing on the situation." The Secretary's face paled. This had now reached the highest levels of government. Whatever decision they made in the next few moments would have repercussions that would echo through the halls of power in Washington and beyond. Samantha stood firm, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. She knew that her suggestion was bold, perhaps even dangerous. But she also knew that it might be the only way to address the root of the problem and bring about real, lasting change. As the Secretary reached for the phone to speak with the President, all eyes in the room turned back to Samantha. The next few moments would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future of the entire U.S. military. The tension in the air was electric as everyone waited to see how this unprecedented situation would unfold. In that moment, standing in her crisp Navy uniform, Lieutenant Commander Samantha Carter found herself at the epicenter of a movement that could reshape the armed forces. The girl who had once dreamed of following in the footsteps of military heroes was now poised to become one herself, not through combat, but through the courage to stand up for what was right. As the Secretary began to speak to the President, Samantha silently steeled herself for what was to come. Whatever happened next, she knew that there was no turning back. The fight for equality and respect in the military had taken an unexpected turn, and she was now at the forefront of a battle that would be fought not with weapons, but with words, courage, and unwavering commitment to change. The room fell into a tense silence as the Secretary spoke with the President. Samantha stood tall, her heart pounding but her resolve unwavering. After what felt like an eternity, the Secretary lowered the phone, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Commander Carter," he began, his voice grave, "the President has made a decision. Based on your suggestion and the unprecedented situation we're facing, he's agreed to launch a comprehensive review of discrimination and respect in the armed forces." A collective gasp went through the room. Samantha felt a surge of hope, but the Secretary wasn't finished. "However," he continued, "he's also ordering an immediate stand-down of all protesting service members. And Lieutenant Commander, he's requesting that you lead this review task force." Samantha's mind reeled. This was beyond anything she could have imagined when she boarded that flight this morning. Leading a task force that could reshape the entire military. The responsibility was enormous. Admiral Johnson stepped forward, his face stern but his eyes showing a glimmer of respect. "Carter, this is highly unorthodox. You'll be under intense scrutiny. Every move you make, every decision, will be analyzed and criticized. Are you prepared for that?" Samantha took a deep breath, thinking of all those who had faced discrimination, who had fought for respect and dignity in uniform. She thought of the young girl at the airport, looking up at her with wonder. She knew what she had to do. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to take on this responsibility." The room erupted into action. Aides rushed to prepare statements. Advisors huddled to discuss strategy. Amidst the chaos, Samantha's phone buzzed again. This time, there was a video call from her parents. As she answered, she saw their faces filled with pride and concern. "We saw everything on the news, Sam," her mother said, tears in her eyes. "We're so proud of you." Her father, the old soldier, simply nodded. "You're making history, kiddo. Stay strong." Those words of support steeled Samantha's resolve. As she ended the call, she turned back to face the room, ready to take on the challenge ahead. But just as the momentum seemed to be building towards positive change, an aide burst into the room, his face pale. "Sir, ma'am," he stammered, "we have a problem. Some of the protesters are refusing to stand down. They're saying they won't stop until they see concrete action, not just promises of a review." The room fell silent once again. The fragile progress they had made suddenly seemed in danger of unraveling. All eyes turned to Samantha, waiting to see how she would handle this new crisis. In that moment, Samantha knew that her next actions would define not just the success of this task force, but the very future of equality and respect in the military. She stepped forward, her mind racing, but her voice clear. "Sir," she addressed the secretary, "with your permission, I'd like to address the protesters directly. Not as a superior officer, but as someone who understands their frustration and shares their goals." The secretary hesitated, then nodded. "Make it happen," he ordered. Within minutes, a video link was set up, broadcasting to bases across the country where protests were ongoing. Samantha faced the camera, acutely aware that her words would be heard by thousands of service members, as well as millions of civilians watching at home. "To all those standing up for equality and respect in our armed forces," she began, her voice strong and clear, "I hear you, I see you, and I stand with you." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The President has authorized a comprehensive review of discrimination in the military, and I have been asked to lead this task force, but I can't do it alone. I need your help." Samantha leaned closer to the camera, her eyes intense. "I'm asking you to stand down not because your concerns aren't valid, but because I need you to stand with me in a different way. Join this task force. Be the voice of change from within. Together, we can create lasting change that will benefit not just us, but all those who will serve after us." As she spoke, reports started coming in. Protesters were laying down their signs. The crowds were dispersing. Her words had struck a chord, offering a path forward that honored their concerns while maintaining military order. The room breathed a collective sigh of relief. The immediate crisis had been averted, but Samantha knew this was just the beginning. The real work was yet to come. As the adrenaline of the moment began to fade, Samantha felt the weight of her new responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had started this day as a Navy officer fighting for her own dignity. She was ending it as the leader of a movement that could reshape the entire military. The secretary approached her, extending his hand. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Commander Carter. Or should I say, Task Force Leader Carter. You got a tough road ahead, but you've already shown you're up for the challenge." As Samantha shook his hand, she felt a mix of emotions: pride, determination, and a touch of apprehension. But most of all, she felt hope. Hope for real change. Hope for a military where everyone could serve with dignity and respect. Just then, her phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from the young girl she had met at the airport earlier. "Thank you for being brave," it read. "When I grow up, I want to be just like you." Samantha smiled, linking back tears. This was why she had taken her stand. This was why she would continue to fight. For that little girl, and for all those who dreamed of serving their country with pride and dignity. As she looked around the room, at the faces of those who would be working alongside her to bring about this change, Samantha knew that the journey ahead would be challenging. But she was ready. Ready to face whatever came next, ready to be the leader that the military, and the nation, needed in this moment of transformation. The story of the Black Navy officer denied first-class seating had become so much more. It had become a catalyst for change, a rallying cry for equality, and the beginning of a new chapter in military history. And Lieutenant Commander Samantha Carter was ready to lead the charge, one step at a time, towards a future where respect and dignity were guaranteed for all who chose to serve. In the weeks that followed, Lieutenant Commander Samantha Carter found herself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The task force she led became a beacon of hope for service members across all branches of the military. Her inbox was flooded with messages from soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, all sharing their experiences and offering support. The work was challenging, often pushing Samantha to her limits. She spent long hours poring over reports, conducting interviews, and drafting proposals. But every time she felt overwhelmed, she thought of that little girl at the airport and found renewed strength. 1 month into the review, Samantha stood before a panel of high-ranking officers, including Admiral Johnson, to present their initial findings. The room was tense, filled with skeptics who doubted real change was possible. "Gentlemen," Samantha began, her voice steady, "what we've uncovered is both troubling and hopeful. While instances of discrimination are more widespread than previously acknowledged, we've also found an overwhelming desire for change among our service members." As she laid out their findings and recommendations, Samantha could see the expressions in the room shifting. Doubt gave way to understanding, skepticism to determination. At the end of her presentation, even the harshest critics were nodding in agreement. Admiral Johnson approached her afterward, a rare smile on his face. "Well done, Carter. You've given us a lot to think about, and a clear path forward." Meanwhile, the airline industry was undergoing its own transformation. Inspired by Samantha's stand, several major carriers had launched comprehensive reviews of their own policies. The captain she had spoken with, Michael Reynolds, had become an advocate for change within his company. 3 months into the task force's work, Samantha received an unexpected invitation. The president wanted to meet with her at the White House to discuss the progress of the review. As she walked through those historic halls, Samantha couldn't help but reflect on how far she'd come. The president greeted her warmly in the Oval Office. "Lieutenant Commander Carter," he said, shaking her hand, "I've been following your work closely. You've started something remarkable." Their discussion was frank and productive. Samantha laid out the task force's findings and recommendations, not shying away from the difficult truths they'd uncovered. The president listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering his full support. As their meeting concluded, he said something that would stay with Samantha for years to come. "You know, Commander, when I first heard about what happened on that plane, I thought it was just another unfortunate incident. But you've turned it into a movement for positive change. That's real leadership." Back at her office, Samantha found an email waiting for her. It was from the young girl she'd met at the airport, now a few months older but no less inspired. The girl had started a diversity club at her school, inspired by Samantha's actions. Attached was a photo of the club members, all smiling proudly. Samantha felt tears well up in her eyes as she realized the ripple effect of her stand for dignity. 6 months into the review, the task force released its comprehensive report. The document laid bare the challenges facing minority service members, but also outlined a clear path forward. It called for changes in training, promotion practices, and accountability measures. Most importantly, it emphasized the need for a cultural shift within the military, one that valued diversity and respect as key strengths. The report's release was met with widespread acclaim. Civil rights leaders praised its thoroughness and honesty. Military officials, while acknowledging the difficult road ahead, committed to implementing its recommendations. Even international allies took note, with several countries reaching out to learn from the U.S. military's approach. On the 1-year anniversary of the incident that had started it all, Samantha found herself back at the same airport. This time, she wasn't just passing through. She had been invited to speak at a conference on diversity in aviation, co-hosted by the airline industry and the military. As she approached the gate where it had all begun, Samantha was struck by how much had changed. The same gate agent who had denied her first-class seating a year ago now greeted her with a warm smile and a salute. "Welcome, Commander Carter," she said. "We're honored to have you here." Samantha's speech at the conference was met with a standing ovation. She spoke not just of the challenges they'd overcome, but of the work still to be done. "Real change," she said, "doesn't happen overnight. It requires constant vigilance, ongoing education, and a commitment from each of us to do better every day." As she concluded her speech, Samantha noticed a familiar face in the audience. It was the older gentleman who had spoken up for her that day on the plane. He approached her afterward, tears in his eyes. "I knew you were something special that day," he said, shaking her hand. "But I had no idea just how much you'd changed things. My granddaughter just enlisted in the Navy, and I know she'll have a better experience because of you." In the years that followed, Samantha's work continued to make waves. The military saw a significant increase in recruitment and retention of minority service members. Reports of discrimination decreased, while job satisfaction among all service members rose. The task force's recommendations became a model for other institutions grappling with similar issues. Samantha herself rose through the ranks, eventually becoming one of the highest-ranking women of color in the Navy. But she never forgot where it all started, with a simple stand for dignity and respect. 5 years after that fateful flight, Samantha stood on the deck of a Navy ship, watching a new class of recruits arrive. Among them was a familiar face, the little girl from the airport, now a young woman ready to serve her country. As the young recruit approached, Samantha smiled. "Welcome aboard, sailor," she said. "Are you ready to make a difference?" The young woman stood tall, her eyes shining with determination. "Yes, ma'am," she replied. "You taught me that one person can change things. I'm here to do my part." Samantha nodded, feeling a sense of pride and hope for the future. As she looked out over the diverse group of new recruits, she knew that the work wasn't finished. There would always be challenges to face, battles to fight, but she also knew that they were on the right path. The story of the Black Navy officer denied first-class seating had become more than just a viral moment or a policy change. It had become a symbol of progress, a reminder that standing up for what's right can have far-reaching consequences. It had sparked a movement that continued to grow and evolve, touching lives far beyond the military. As the sun set over the ocean, Samantha thought about all the twists and turns that had led her to this moment. From a disputed seat on a plane to the forefront of a national movement for equality, her journey had been anything but ordinary. But then again, real change never comes from playing it safe or accepting the status quo. She turned to address the new recruits, her voice carrying across the deck. "Remember," she said, "every one of you has the power to make a difference. It might not always be easy, and it might not happen overnight. But if you stand tall, speak up, and never lose sight of what's right, you can change the world. I know, because I've seen it happen." As the recruits cheered, Samantha felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey that had begun with a simple request for respect had transformed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. And as she looked to the future, she knew that the best was yet to come. The story of the Black Navy officer denied first-class seating had come full circle. But in many ways, it was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Samantha, but for all those who dared to stand up for dignity, respect, and equality. As the ship set sail, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of a new generation of service members, Samantha knew that the ripples of change would continue to spread, touching lives and transforming institutions for years to come.